Good evening. Brown University and the Baptist Church in Warren are so glad that you came out tonight. To be one of the places where Ted's book is being seen for the first time is a very special thing. I am going to warn you, as you leave tonight, you step up and you do it automatically. When you walk down, get out of the pews, somehow you don't remember and there's stumbling happening. So I want to warn you, there is a step down when you get out of the pews today. And after Ted's talk with us and question and answering, there will be sweets downstairs, a totally different menu than what you had. The wine and the coffee will still be there. And also on the table with the 250th Brown University pens are our RAT cards. They are a self-guided tour of the church, its people, and its history. Not quite as detailed as you have in your book, because it doesn't fit in this amount of space. We're very, very glad to have you here, Ted.
Thank you so much.
Thank you much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? It is quite exciting to be speaking from a pulpit to all of you. It's wonderful to be in this very important Rhode Island church. I've driven by this building many, many times. I've never been inside. I feel like I've already seen 3 or 4 items of extraordinary historic significance, including the amazing weather vane that says 1764 right in the stairwell that was on the roof of the first structure as Brown was coming into existence, and you couldn't have a more visible symbol of the founding of Brown University and of this church in 1764 than that. Of course. Is that better? Maybe I shouldn't have gone. I mean, maybe it's a good thing I did not go into the ministry. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I wanted to thank a few people for being here. My brother is in the building. I think he's intimidated by the formality of this room, and I don't see him. But my soul brother, Ambassador Bill Twaddell, is here, and a lot of old friends from various aspects of my life, including my long childhood, growing up not too far, well, in Providence. But I've always had a fondness for Warren, Rhode Island, going back to the 70s when this was about the only place you could buy soccer equipment, at the gob shop. And to this day, I still don't know what a gob is. I just know that you had to go to the gob shop to get soccer balls and soccer cleats. I also am a loyal patron of the Warren DMV. It's the best DMV in the state. If you come at the right time, lines are very short. But the Warren DMV pales in significance with this unbelievable institution. And I was saying, I don't think you could hear me, that even walking up the stairs into this chamber to give this talk, I saw an object of unbelievable significance to the history of Brown University, which is the weather vane that was on top of the original church structure that stood on this site where Brown first began to give classes. It was known as Rhode Island College in the 1760s, but the weather vane says 1764 very clearly. So that's an item that I don't think we have in our inventory at Brown. Eve and Kat, I don't think, knew about it. I certainly did not. We might have put it on the cover of our book if we'd known. So if maybe in 50 years, if we're still around, we'll try it again. But Bill, I wanted to let you know that in the back room downstairs, there are some historic treasures, and there is a mystery book. There's a book that appears to be written in an old cribbed colonial hand and some code writing downstairs, and it's actually called the Mystery Book. So I'm saying that because a few years ago, Bill Twaddell and I got very interested in a manuscript in the John Carter Brown Library that was rumored to be written by Roger Williams, the great founder of Rhode Island, and much of it was in a coded language, a kind of hieroglyphics that no one could read. No one had ever been able to read except Roger Williams. So, and librarians had just accepted that it was unreadable. And Bill convened a committee, first of Brown faculty, and the beauty of this story is the faculty were stumped, but then some undergraduates got on the case, and they cracked the code, and we had the first new piece of writing by Roger Williams in 300 plus years. And so there's something very similar downstairs, and Reverend Irish has invited me back to look at it. And so that's the beauty of history, is that we think we know all the stories, and we don't. And we uncover new evidence, or we come up with new ways of reading the evidence, or we see players who were perhaps standing to the side of the main action, who are intensely interesting in their own right, and that flavors each new telling of the story. So I have just finished spending 2 years, roughly, writing a new history of Brown University. And it was a really exciting project that I brought a lot of background to. I grew up in Rhode Island, as I said, and I had gathered the histories of Brown over a long life of reading Rhode Island history. And I found, to my surprise, there was a lot in the story that could be told again in an effective new way. And so I tried very hard to write in a way that would engage new audiences, and I hope you will agree that this book does that. There have been histories of Brown written before, and I was a little bit mortified to consult one of my best sources. It's a pamphlet that was written for the 150th in 1914. We just celebrated the 250th. And the author delivered this. It's a very good essay on the early years of Brown University, 1764 to 1770, so exactly the time it was in Warren, Rhode Island. And this pamphlet originated as a lecture in this church on October 13th, 1914. So I hope I'm not just walking in the same pathways as earlier historians, but I don't think I am. I think I found some interesting new material, and I want to tell you a little bit about this book. Now, there is a longer history of Brown being prepared as we speak, and I wanted to respect that book and not write a comprehensive history. So what I decided to do is I wrote 5 essays about 50-year periods, the 5 50-year periods that added up to 250 years. And I began, obviously, with the founding and the time here in Warren and the move to Providence, and the naming of Brown University in 1804 was essentially my first chapter. And I'm going to mostly concentrate on that time tonight, because I know that's the time you, as citizens of Warren, are most interested in. By the way, I welcome your questions while I'm talking. One of the core assumptions of Brown University in its early days was that it was not going to teach in the way of Harvard University. It was going to be more open to to vernacular languages and not to teach in classical Latin, but also to avoid hierarchies of learning. And just to cite one example, students were listed alphabetically when they graduated and not by their social prominence, the way they were at Harvard. So I'd like to give as informal a talk as possible. And if, as I'm saying something, you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. So obviously, religion was extraordinarily important to the founding of Brown University. It feels comfortable to say that here in a house of worship, but it also is obviously true from any careful study of the historical record. The 2 ingredients that went into the founding of Brown University were its place, Rhode Island, which I spend a fair amount of time defining at the beginning of this book, and then the Baptists. And we're in a Baptist church, and I think Americans have a certain set of ideas about who the Baptists are. And as I looked into the story more and more, I realized I knew very little about the Baptists, especially about the Baptists of the 17th and 18th century. And I think it's fair to say there was no such thing as a typical Baptist in the middle of the 18th century. Is it still fair to say that? I think so. The more I study this remarkable denomination that's so important throughout American history, the more I come away with deep admiration for their principles, both their religious principles and their political principles, and they're not so far apart from each other. So I take, as I said, a fair amount of time to define the place. I go back even to the century before Roger Williams arrived here in 1636, and I talk about the Italian explorer Verrazzano, who came to Narragansett Bay in 1524 and found it the most beautiful place that he saw in North America, and he gave it a name. He called it Refugio, an Italian name for a place of refuge, which is amazing because it's exactly what Rhode Island became a century later when Roger Williams was banished from Boston to these shores. And there's speculation that he was down in this part of what became Rhode Island before moving to where he famously rode across the Seekonk River and landed near the site of the Dunkin' Donuts on Gano Street. And then I've never quite understood why he then paddled around India Point and up the Providence River to the place of his home lot near the Roger Williams National Park site, when he could have just walked from that Gano Street location over the hill. It would have saved him a fair amount of time. But that's the way the story is. The more you think about it, the more loopholes there are in it. And Roger Williams was obviously a person I wanted to get right with as I was setting the scene for what would become Brown University. He's a remarkable person who is defiant of authority throughout a long life. He comes up from a rather low-born background, although he's exposed to great thinkers early on. He's a note-taker for the eminent English jurist Sir Edward Coke, spelled C-O-C-K-E. And he goes to Cambridge University and is one of the best educated of all of the English immigrants, including to Boston in the 17th century. He spoke, I believe he spoke 7 languages, including the Narragansett Indian language, which he spoke better than anyone at that time who came from England. And he not only spoke it, he wrote a book about it that is in many ways the founding document of Rhode Island. And I'll get to the Brown story in a minute, but I like pausing here because for so long the people of Boston and Massachusetts looked down their noses at the people of Rhode Island as religiously scruffy in nearly every way. And it was precisely that condescension that created a sense among Rhode Islanders that they needed an institution of high learning of their own, to train their ministers. That was the basic purpose of the College of Rhode Island, was to train ministers, and overwhelmingly they were Baptist ministers, but also to educate the citizenry to be able to answer questions and insults as they often came from Boston. But I like going back to the founding moment because Roger Williams so clearly was not intellectually inferior to the people of Boston. He spoke more languages than they did. He wrote this remarkable book in 1643 called A Key into the Language of America that is a profoundly interesting anthropological study of the natives and what their folkways were like and what their religion was like, everything about them. And that book was in many ways the book that brought the state into existence, or I should say the colony. Almost every American colony was founded in England by a well-connected person or group of people who purchased the right to a huge area of real estate here, and then having purchased it from the king, came over and settled it either individually or with friends. And Roger Williams uniquely came up with the idea of a colony in the act of exploring it. So he was banished, as we all know, those of us who grew up in Rhode Island, and came here with very little idea of what was going to happen next. And at that moment, he immersed himself in the study of the Narragansett language and lived quite closely with the natives, and in fact had no choice. It was the only way he could survive. And by writing that book about them, he established considerable currency for himself back in London, but it was an intellectual currency. It wasn't because he had money, he didn't. It wasn't because he was aristocratic, he wasn't. It's because he had a really good idea. And the idea was that different peoples living here could live together in a spirit of tolerance and acceptance. And London was ready for that idea. And Parliament in 1644 gave the first patent to what would become Rhode Island. It was first called the Providence Plantations, and then 1663, the official charter of the colony of Rhode Island was issued. But it all happened because Roger Williams had a founding idea of tolerance that remained very important. And throughout the rest of the 17th century and into the 18th century, Rhode Islanders slowly came together as a colony, but it was very slow. They were nowhere near as well organized as Massachusetts or Connecticut on either side. And for a long time, it wasn't entirely clear that Rhode Island would succeed as a colony. And Massachusetts and Connecticut were sending settlers in to compete for land with the Rhode Islanders. And so the founding of the College of Rhode Island was in many ways a counterattack. It was a way to establish a kind of legitimacy for this colony of outcasts and to establish some respectability when they didn't have a great deal of that. So that's a long way of background, a long bit of background about the place. But then I want to talk about the people, the Baptists, who also were so important. And not all of them were Rhode Islanders. Many of them were. But in fact, the first impulse to found a new Baptist college came in Philadelphia in 1762. Philadelphia was the only place in North America that had a Baptist association. Because the Baptists, I hate to put it so bluntly, they were terribly organized. And that was a key to who they were. They were a people who resisted top-down authority. They didn't want to be told what to do. They wanted to worship in peace, away from civil authorities and away from religious authorities. And so the further away they could get from places like Boston or London, the happier they were. And so Baptists were thriving in the interior riverways of North America or in the valleys. Pennsylvania was becoming a place, a real stronghold of the Baptists. And so Philadelphia, as the largest city in America at the time, had a Baptist association. And in 1762, a man named Morgan Edwards, who was a recent Welsh immigrant, stood and made a proposal that the Baptists establish a college of their own. And the proposal was greeted with some skepticism, but they agreed to look around, and two locations were especially promising: South Carolina and Rhode Island. And of course, Rhode Island became the place, and it helped a great deal that there were a few small Baptist congregations already here. There was one in Providence and two in Newport. And crucially, there were 60 people here in Warren who wanted to create a church but didn't yet have a minister. And that was an absolutely crucial fact, because the Baptist Association had a minister, but they needed a church to put him in. His name was James Manning, and he was a very talented young graduate of Princeton University. So there were two halves of a plan that needed to go together. The Baptists here in Warren wanted to build a church, and they wanted to hire a minister. And the Baptist Association in Philadelphia wanted to start a college, but they needed a church to pay some money to the minister so he could survive. And it says a lot about the modesty of this plan to say that the church was by far the more important ingredient than the infant College of Rhode Island in 1764. It took a lot of work to build the building, and it's so exciting to see that weather vane, because I think that's the only sign of the original building, probably. Really, and that could well have been burnt by the British burnt by the British because the British came through Warren and burnt the original church in 1778, I want to say. Well, that's fascinating. 1778. What a lucky guess. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for laughing, Reverend Irish. So the Baptists, I can't say enough about them, and I also want to go briefly into some genealogy of this particular congregation, because one of the more exciting discoveries I made in my research was learning that the Baptists here had come down from Swansea, Massachusetts. And there is a very old congregation of Baptists there that is the parent church of this church. I'm glad you're nodding, because I defer to your authority. But there's still a church there. It's not the original church, but it's in the original location, just off Route 6. Is everything right that I've said so far? Okay. But a really important church from 1663, in the lifetime of Roger Williams, the year of the Great Rhode Island Charter. And the more I look into that Swansea congregation, the more fascinating they are. So they came over from Wales. And Brown's, as I said, the man in Philadelphia who proposed the new college was also Welsh. So there's an interesting, Welsh people were Baptists. And if you go around Narragansett Bay, you'll see town names: Swansea, Newport, Taunton is in Massachusetts, but I believe those are all place names from Wales. So the Baptist inheritance was very important in southeastern New England, and I think there's a concept that hasn't been clearly articulated in early American history, which tends to be dominated by the study of Boston. And I think there was a really important kind of person in Bristol County, Massachusetts, who was a lot like a Rhode Islander. We know what the Rhode Islanders were like, and we know what the Bostonians were like, but there were a lot of people around Middleborough, Massachusetts, Taunton, Bridgewater, who were very important free thinkers, and they didn't especially defer to the authority of Boston either. So they were a lot like the people in Providence. And I think there was a feeling of cousinhood between Bristol County, Massachusetts, Bristol County, Rhode Island. As many of you know, Warren didn't even come into Rhode Island until 1747, I think, 46, 47. So Warren is a part of Massachusetts for a long time. But what I'm trying to say is it was a kind of gray zone of no particular authority from anyone, not from Boston, not from London. And that's how they liked it. That's how Baptists were. They wanted to worship in peace. And there's a fascinating original document from the founding of that Swansea church that's now in the John Hay Library that I think is a very important document in the history of free speech in this country, that explains why they came over to Swansea in 1663. So those people were the ancestor of this church. The 60 people had come down here and wanted to build a new church, and James Manning suddenly appeared and was available. So he is anointed as the minister of this church, and the first thing he does is build the church. Founding Brown comes second. And this is his real job. He's the minister of, he's your predecessor. He's the minister of this church. He opens a Latin school, although as the historian who wrote this pamphlet jokingly said, he probably should have opened an English school because the spelling in the original records is so terrible. The original documents calling for a building here call for a meetin house, Meeten. And he counts about 20 different ways they spell parsonage. And the original college was in the parsonage. So there was a building built for James Manning to live in. I assume it was all in this footprint. I think the original church was small and the parsonage was right next door. And it was in the parsonage in the second story that the original classes of Brown University met. And the teaching ratio was very good. It was 1-to-1 in the first year of Brown's existence. And the reason it was 1-to-1 is there was one member of the faculty and only one student. And he was 14 years old. So it wasn't much of a university. It was just a very small kind of apprentice shop of some kind, or like almost like a night school attached to a church. And that was the beginning, but it was an important beginning. And from that beginning, a lot of things happened. So the church was built. An important association of Baptists was headquartered here in Warren in 1767. And more students began to come. In the early days, as many came from New Jersey as from Rhode Island. And as the college attracted more students, it began to outgrow the small room, not even a building, the small room that it inhabited here in Warren. And I found another sign recently that helped me to understand why perhaps a college was seeking to set itself up elsewhere after the founding here. Warren was cracking down, as it was becoming more Baptist, it was cracking down on misbehavior. And in the late 1760s, it built 2 pillories. Pillories being the wooden devices you stick your head in when you have done something wrong. And one was right out there on the sidewalk. And pillories and undergraduates do not mix. So in the late 1760s, a lot of change was happening in Rhode Island. Providence was growing very, very quickly. It's a great decade for Providence. Newport was also at its peak of wealth in the last decade before the American Revolution. Warren was growing much more slowly. And whether it was a pull factor that Providence and Newport really wanted a college to come to their towns, or whether it was a push factor that Warren was just a little small and conservative and perhaps too Baptist for a college that was already feeling its oats a little bit. In any event, in late 1769, the corporation threw open the question, where should Rhode Island College go next? And a furious battle ensued between Providence and Newport. Newport had many advantages. It had about twice as many people. It had more money. It was closer to the Atlantic Ocean. It had a balmier climate. In many ways, it had stronger relationships with the crown, but it had some disadvantages too. I think the rate of increase of wealth was actually faster in Providence. I think money was being made more quickly in Providence by one family in particular, the remarkable Brown family, which had not yet established its domination over what would become the College of Rhode Island. It was one of many Rhode Island families interested in this college, but not yet the dominant family. But Providence was significantly more Baptist than Newport. Newport was very Catholic with a lowercase c. It had a lot of different denominations, and Providence had significant Baptist energy and money, including the Brown family themselves. And when I seek to understand why Brown moved to Providence, it's not only the 4 Brown brothers were there, but if you look at the steeple of the First Baptist Church on North Main Street, it radiates a kind of confidence that was, I think, a little bit new to Baptists. Baptist churches were small wooden buildings tucked away from view normally, without bells usually, although this original church did have a bell. The second, that makes more sense to me, because the early ones in the 17th and 18th century were extraordinarily simple places. They were usually, I think, like a house with 4 walls and no elaborate upper story architecture, no bells. Often ministers were really just members of the congregation who would take a leading role in reading or talking, but they were not trained ministers in any sense. They didn't wear the garments that we associate with congregational ministers from Massachusetts at that time. So the building of the great Baptist church, now called the First Baptist Church, but it isn't the first building. It's on the site of where Roger Williams first accepted Baptist principles not long after coming to Providence. But that building is really quite an un-Baptist looking building, if that makes sense. It's ambitious. It's showy. And if you follow the steeple upwards with your eye, which you can't help following because it's right in your face as you're driving down Angel Street or driving up Waterman Street, it's impossible not to see. And I believe that was the intent of that remarkable building. It's got elaborate carpentry. It does about 20 things as it moves up. It changes as the steeple continues upwards. And the size of the building is incredible. I mean, it could have contained about half the population of Providence at the time it was built in the early 1770s. So not only the city of Providence, but the Baptists in particular were very strong in Providence. And I think that was an important reason why what became Brown ultimately did move to Providence, Rhode Island. So the Baptists are an absolutely essential part of this story and continued to be for a long time after the move. If Brown became faintly less Baptist, decade by decade, it retained a strong connection to the Baptist faith for a very long time. It wasn't until 1928 that the requirement that the president be a Baptist was removed. And there still are Baptist presidents. Ruth Simmons was technically a Baptist, although I don't think it was part of her resume that anyone noticed. But as I studied her life, I realized that she was a Baptist also. And so the echo of the Baptist faith is still present on campus. And I think intellectually it fits also, because the Baptists were so strong in defending their right to free speech. And they really, there were many religious principles they believed in, baptism by immersion being the main one. But they believed passionately in their freedom of speech from the state. And what that meant very specifically, I learned this with more specificity over the course of the last year or two. It wasn't simply the right to say what you think, which was pretty easy to possess in colonial America because policemen were so few and far between and the distances were so great. But what the Baptists really hated was to be taxed for the support of an established church that was not their church. And that was the practice more often than not throughout colonial America. So in Massachusetts until 1833, so for 50 years into the United States, if you were a citizen of Massachusetts anywhere, you were assessed a tax that went right into the coffers of the Congregational Church, what had been the Puritan Church and is now called the Church of Christ. And if you were a citizen of Virginia, you were assessed a tax that went right into the Anglican Church, what became the Episcopalian Church. And that drove Baptists crazy. It was fine if they had freedom of speech, great, but if they had to pay in to support another church, that made them go absolutely crazy. And so what the First Amendment to the Constitution specifically says is there shall be no establishment of religion. And the word establishment is the way the Baptists talked about it. They didn't want a structure of religion embedded in government that then was taxing the citizens of a colony or state. And so that word establishment, it's called the Establishment Clause. It's perhaps the most important part of the U.S. Constitution, is a direct legacy of the great Baptist faith as the people came to these parts, not all believing exactly the same thing as each other, but knowing that they didn't want a state-imposed religion on them and a tax to go along with it. And that defiance of orthodoxy and of imposed thinking from above is very true to Brown University to this day. And it's manifested in as many different beliefs as there are undergraduates on that campus. And every year there's a different eruption of some kind, and it's wonderful. But the connection across the centuries, to my mind, is not that tenuous. There's a real direct link to the kind of people who came here, who stood up for their way of thinking, who built structures that could house new places of learning as well as of worship, and then permitted Brown to go away when Brown needed to go away. But what happened here for 5 years in Warren was very special. It wasn't just a random 5 years. And Warren should not feel any disappointment that Brown ultimately moved to the bigger city at the head of Narragansett Bay, because in those 5 years, Brown got its first president, who was a very important, a very good president. It got its first students, the one student, William Rogers, in 1765, but then a couple dozen by the end of the decade, and those people were students of quality. You could see what they did in the American Revolution. One of them, Jonathan Varnum, was a very important local soldier, and one of the great stories of Rhode Island history is the Battle of Rhode Island that took place on the northern part of Aquidneck Island in 1778. It would have been 3 months after the British burned the church here. Rhode Islanders took the fight to them in Aquidneck, and James Varnum had the idea that African Americans here in Rhode Island are intelligent, capable people. Some are enslaved, some are not, but let's put them in the American army and fight against the British. And it was a really important pioneering act of racial inclusion in not only a military effort, but a defining act of citizenship, of belief in the new country that was trying to come into existence. So that came from a Brown student who had been educated here in Warren. There were 2 chaplains at Valley Forge in the hardest winter of the American Revolution who were Warren students of Rhode Island College. And the first commencement was held here in 1769. And it became the model for all commencements, including the one we're about to experience in 2 weeks. So a lot happened here to shape the mold that would become Brown University. And it's thrilling to be back and to see these remnants. I also loved the building next door that is from the 1750s, and it gave a feeling of the neighborhood the neighborhood of small wooden houses that must have surrounded the small wooden building that was on this spot. So we are standing on sacred ground in every sense. It's a house of worship, but it's really where the great university that would become Brown University came into existence and defined itself. It was an eventful 5 years. So everything else that happened, and I would tell you the rest of the story, but we'd all be here until sunrise. It received a strong definition during the 5 years of the Warren period. Now, if you're interested in knowing in great detail what that period was like, I recommend this pamphlet, and maybe I should make a photocopy for you because it's so interesting. And I loved it because it was written by a Brown graduate from the class of 1859 named William Williams Keene, K-E-E-N. And time is so small in Rhode Island, and space is so small in Rhode Island, that it was only a couple generations away from the founding in the way he remembered it. So he spoke 101 years ago. He spoke in the fall of 1914. And he begins by saying his grandparents were married by William Rogers, who was the original student, the 14-year-old who came here. And his parents knew Morgan Edwards, the man who made the original first motion that a university be created. So it's not too many steps from one generation to the next back to the founding. And it's not too many steps literally around Rhode Island to get from one important place to another. So whether we go by water or land, Warren and Providence are really connected in this story. So why don't I end there? I think I might have gone well past half an hour, but I do want to take questions if anyone has them. And can we arrange any baptisms if anyone... Oh, thanks, Steve. I only just heard, as Bill knows, I'm interested in church architecture, and he's been inviting me to come up the steeple of the First Unitarian Church where we attend. And it's such a relief to be in a well-defined Christian church, because at our church, we love our church, but they're really afraid to even say Merry Christmas to each other for fear of offending anyone. And it's not a baptism, it's a naming ceremony. So it's nice to be in a genuine church, if I can say that. Yes, Bill? I had to ease in, yeah. Thank you.
Very essential first step.
In this pamphlet, he talks about the style of preaching of the day, and a minister would bring an hourglass, which meant 1 hour, and he would turn it over 3 times, and that was a sermon. So the third one was the final lap. And if you think I talked a little too long, it was barely half of one turn of the hourglass, so. Oh, but what I was going to say with the First Baptist Church and church architecture is I only found out last week from a friend who has been up in the upper stories of the First Baptist that there's an immense baptismal tub in the upper stories, which was a very important part of the worship. So somewhere in the upper stories, there's a kind of metal fount for baptisms up. Oh, you have it right there. I thought that was a jacuzzi. So you do full immersion baptisms, and that's wonderful. Well, that was the kind of there were different Baptists, different kinds. Not everyone was full immersion, but these people were. But Brown did have some Seventh-day Adventists early and some Quakers early, and there were special exceptions made in the first decade that the Seventh-day Adventists they were permitted to go to church on Saturday, and the Quakers could wear their hats. They didn't have to doff their hats to people. So Brown was actually pretty enlightened on the question of religious tolerance at the beginning. I want to thank someone who is no longer alive to receive my thanks, but there was a professor at Brown in the 60s, 70s, and 80s named Bill McLaughlin, whom some of you must have known, who wrote really learned books about not only the Baptists, but the dissenters, the immense variety of dissenters in the 18th and early 19th century, and how interesting they were, and how alive in their minds they were. And these topics that seem now like rather narrow differences between Protestant denominations were really important. It was the stuff of life, maybe not life and death, but of very important personal identity. And he brought those subjects alive. And for me to read his books seriously, I had not really taken time to get right with those books, was an important early step for me in writing this project. So I tried hard to do right by the Baptists, and I hope that I did. I'm not a Baptist, as I admitted, but I have a lot of respect for them. And I think they're really important religiously. They're tied to what we call the Great Awakening, which is not a very well-defined religious and social movement of the 1740s in this country, but they really helped to articulate what freedom of speech would become. And Thomas Jefferson, who's not a Baptist, writes a letter to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, while he's president, saying, I completely agree with the way you think about how religion should be separate from the state. So I would say Jefferson is a quasi-Baptist, and there are a lot of quasi this or that in the 18th century, and that's exciting. So hopefully this talk is a beginning and not an end, and Bill and I might be coming down with a few code breakers to look at that manuscript downstairs. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Oh, all right. Yes, ma'am.
What year was this building?
I think 1844. I just saw on a stone. Sorry. Oh, can you repeat the question? You're saying it to me. What year was this building built? And I saw a stone marker that I believe said 1844. And this is the third? Is that right? Okay. It's a beautiful church. Eve?
Was there much opposition from the sort of the national body of the Baptist community in the 1930s when the corporation...
That's a fascinating question. If you'll permit another half an hour answer. Well, what I want to say is there have been several ruptures within the Baptist Church that are really interesting. One comes on the eve of the Civil War, when this split happens that has never been repaired. And when we say a Southern Baptist, that's a phrase we all use, it's because the Southern Baptists broke away from a national organization over slavery, which shocked me because I didn't realize the link was that clear, that the Southern Baptists actually separated because of slavery, and they were using their religious training to defend slavery. And Northern Baptists, including all of the people up here, did not want to do that. So that's one rupture that's fascinating. But in the 1920s, a lot is happening in religion in this country, and the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925 over evolution, it's a problem we have, almost 100 years later, we still have not really solved. There are deniers of evolution well into the 21st century, but there were fundamentalist Baptists who were more based in the South, but not exclusively, and the people connected to Brown were in an important, a difficult but principled position where they wanted to be true to the Baptist faith, and they were, but they wanted to fight against what they thought was a fundamentalist misinterpretation of their faith. I hope I said that correctly. And President William Faunce of Brown was a very brave national leader in that fight, and he took a lot of criticism from Baptists around the South and West at a time when Brown needed to raise money, as it always did, but he took a very principled stand, and his quiet backer was not someone who did not like controversy in public, but was also very principled and brave, and that was John D. Rockefeller Jr., who really supported Faunce in all of this, and in the 1920s gave a lot of money to all kinds of organizations that were trying to bring modernity into the 20th century, including the Museum of Modern Art. He supported that. Union Theological Seminary in New York is a great interdenominational shrine that was paid for by Rockefeller. A lot of African American Baptist churches, and that's an extremely important strain of Baptist thinking, is the African American Baptist Church. And John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a lot of money to them. So there are very liberal Baptists and there are very conservative Baptists, and that was something that was quite new to me. But Brown was always on the side of the liberal Baptists. I keep checking Reverend Irish to make sure I haven't overstepped any bounds. The pulpit conveys a feeling of authority, so I'm getting a little bit away from myself. But anything else? Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for coming.